Hey everybody, welcome. Thanks for tuning in. Coming to the next event in our series of why Avalanche Education Matters. I have a really exciting group of people up here speaking. Looking forward to hearing what they have to say. I'm just going to start with a couple logistical bits of information for you all while people are still kind of tuning on in and trickling in. First thing I want to mention is that this whole episode, it'll all be available online on our education tab. You could go on there, you can see last month's webinar, and you'll be able to see the same one trimmed down just a little bit. So if you have to leave early, show up late, you'll probably miss this part, but I'll tell you at the end. You can come back and you can watch any part of it. You can share it with your friends, whatnot. And I also kind of want to just talk a little bit about how it's going to work tonight. So definitely really hoping to hear some questions and some engagement, want to know what you all want to learn more about. So encourage you to kind of get into that Q&A section and answer some questions. Put some questions in there. You can comment on other people's questions. You can upvote questions. And the way this evening's going to work is we'll have Liz come on first. She'll talk a little bit about why Avalanche Education, what that means to her. Then we'll hear from Ann, and then we'll hear from Melis. And then after that, we'll bring all three of them back, and we'll have some time there to really dive into the QA and hope to have some pretty good, meaty discussion there. So hop on in. Don't be a stranger. One thing I do want to remind you of when you see that QA window down in the bottom of your Zoom window is you have to scroll down to the bottom to see kind of most recent questions. So just kind of keep thinking about, constantly scrolling down, see if somebody else has put a question that you might also want to hear an answer to, upvote it, and we'll see how that goes. So without much further ado, we're going to dive right in. Our first speaker here is Liz Riggs-Meter. She's the Director of Recreational Programs at ARI. Really interesting person, full disclosure. I do work at ARI as an instructor trainer, so she is my boss. And so I have been fortunate enough to kind of see her teach, hear what she thinks about education, and I'm really excited about it, inspired about it. And so it's kind of why I like teaching at ARI. So we're going to hear a little bit from her, then we'll hear about Ann and some of her research, which I think you all love and be really interesting, and then we'll hear from Melis. So thanks so much, Liz.
Great, thank you, Greg. Let's get here we go. So when Greg, so hi everyone, I'm Liz Riggs-Meter. Trying to move my screen over here. And as Greg said, I'm the Rec Program Director at ARI, which is, I think most people are aware of this, but we're a nonprofit that creates curriculum to help educators provide high quality avalanche education for recreational travelers. And we also build training for professionals as well. So what that means is that I spend a lot of time thinking about how to promote avalanche education and really why it matters, because we are in the business of trying to convince people to get educated and I guess helping make that available for others. So when Greg and Ann and Melis and I were discussing this and sort of talking through kind of like why it matters to us, this photo that I'm showing here kind of immediately came to mind. I'm a huge believer. I come from outdoor education, and as a middle school teacher, I'm a huge believer in learning from direct experience, because I think the world around us is just a really effective teacher. But what this photo points out is that the world around us, especially if the world is winter backcountry, can be a really unforgiving and harsh teacher. And that's not just because the potential consequence of a mistake can be fatal. It's that the very nature of the snowpack layered over the terrain, coupled with unexpected behaviors of a group of humans, make for a really complex learning environment where actions and their consequences aren't always clearly linked. So as an example, pulling out to this whole photo, this is probably a familiar image or some version of it. And it's oftentimes used to sort of reinforce the danger of the social proof heuristic, that what worked for one group could surely work for another group. And so I think of this photo though in a slightly different spin, thinking about the problem of learning in a winter backcountry environment. So let's presume that all 5 of these tracks came from the same group, and the 5th person was the one that triggered this avalanche. But what would this look like if only 2 people were in the group? The avalanche triggered by the 5th person wouldn't be here. And so what did those two people learn? So how many times do you think you could have easily triggered an avalanche, but just by a roll of the dice, you didn't that day? Did you get any feedback on your actions? And this conundrum to me speaks to the really wicked nature of learning in the winter backcountry and reinforces why education and continued learning is so important. So I want to take a minute to dive into some, I guess, educational theory. I find this intensely fascinating. So all good talks should have a good chart on them. But this is going to explain what we mean by the wicked learning environment. And so this comes from a cognitive psychologist named Robin Hogarth. And he dubbed these feedback poor environments wicked learning environments. And he spent much of his career examining decision-making and development of intuition, and has proposed the schematic to better describe different types of learning environments one might encounter, where the quality of feedback from an event is represented here on the horizontal axis, and the consequence of making an error is represented on the vertical axis. So on the left side of the schematic, the feedback is relevant, so accurate learning is easier. A good example is to think of how a canoe moves as you shift your weight in it. There's a very clear cause and effect. And that learning increases in precision is the consequence of making an error moves from lenient to more exacting. So think about the feedback you get when you get into a canoe kind of cattywampus and you capsize it. You learn very quickly exactly which movement of your body caused it to capsize, and you don't repeat it again. So Hogarth dubs these realms kind learning environments. The trickier learning environment is over here on the left side, what Hogarth dubs a wicked learning environment. And this is where feedback is inconsistent or there's a randomness in the outcomes observed. For example, dealing with the probability of triggering an avalanche. We could travel an avalanche terrain over and over again, over a trigger point even, in similar conditions, but because of the spatial variability of the snowpack, it's inconsistent when we might actually trigger that avalanche. So the consequence of doing the wrong thing is actually quite lenient. So we don't even realize we're making an error. And this can lead to building unfounded confidence in the actions being taken. So when the consequence is exacting, for example, actually being involved in an avalanche, the inconsistent nature of the feedback makes us attribute the wrong action to the outcome. So we might attribute it to a misunderstanding of the terrain or the conditions, but we don't know which it was. So in this photo, skier 1 through 4 experience put them in this quadrant where they didn't trigger an avalanche, and so there was no consequence, no learning happened. And then skier 5 is up here, where the consequence is very exacting and maybe had no opportunity to learn from it because the consequence was too much. So I think now it's very clear I hope that this makes a case for what a tricky learning environment the winter backcountry is, and that 7 days of avalanche education even may not feel like enough. In fact, a lot of us in education worry a lot about this curve, where the education gets you basically to the top of it right here. And this curve, you may be familiar, it's something that demonstrates the Dunning-Kruger effect, where it's basically the people who are least knowledgeable about something have the greatest confidence in their skills and abilities. And so if we're in a wicked or a high consequence environment, we want to not linger at that top of that, at the top of that peak at all. In fact, we don't want to spend any time there. And so really our goal as educators and as learners should be to get to this middle area where we can both recognize what we don't know, appropriately make decisions to accommodate for that, and then also begin to target our learning. And so this is really what gets into the importance of education, is not so much that the 7 days that you have on a course or maybe even continuing education that comes after it is going to teach you everything, but it's going to give you a process in which you can manage your risk while continuing to gain experience. And so instead of thinking about why avalanche education matters, I like to flip it and think more about avalanche learning matters. And so when you are seeking out educational experience, it's really about how do I continue learning, and how do I continue learning in a way that where I gain a lot more feedback in what we're calling a wicked or feedback poor environment. And so I'm going to use the specifics of Erie again, because that's the curriculum that I work with. But really, high quality education is going to focus on giving you a risk management process that you can use no matter your experience. So that process should scale to, I'm just learning how to do this, including possibly learning how to move on my mode of travel of choice in the backcountry, to I have been skiing, riding, on a snowmobile, whatever, for a really long, climbing for a really long time in the backcountry. And I need a process that's responsive to that. And so that's the Erie framework here is one of those risk management processes. And the meat and potatoes, I guess, of it is this plan, ride, debrief down here, which is this daily routine of planning where you identify before going out, you identify and name the hazard, and you kind of assign a confidence or like a range of certainty with that hazard. And then you make terrain choices in response, because terrain is the tool that you have to manage your risk. Then once you're in the field, you use the ride portion here to maintain situational awareness of both the hazard and checking in, or like, is the terrain that we're choosing in line with the plan that we set forth? And then at the end of the day, you debrief that whole thing and compare was what we were expecting, what we actually found, and if there is a difference, what caused the difference, so that we can learn again and manage our risk the next time. So in addition to giving you that risk management process that you can use to safely build experience, this is also a learning process that you can use to counter that wicked learning environment. It's not necessarily going to help you predict avalanches better, but it's going to help you build your pattern recognition skills. That just primes you to notice more, maintain that situational awareness more, and really direct your learning. So in that planning process, no matter what level of detail you're going into, you're making some type of prediction about the conditions, about the hazard. You're saying, I think based on the information that I have, it's going to be like this. And then you go into the field and you are maintaining that situational awareness. You're making observations about what's going on around you. And in a sense, you're taking data to compare back against your prediction. Then at the end of the day, you compare. So this is partly why one of the hallmarks of our, or I guess one of the prompting questions of our debrief, is to summarize the conditions. So it's as a group to say, what did we actually observe out here? All come to agreement on that. And then we compare that to, was that what we expected? Was it completely off from what we expected? And if there was a difference, what caused that difference? Or if it was the same, what did we do to get it right? So for example, I think this is one I can still remember when I was new to backcountry skiing, is getting the timing around corn skiing. And I'm a skier, so I sort of, I hope that you can, for climbers and snowmobilers, can make the slight context shift. But thinking about corn skiing, it's really timing specific, and you can, I feel like when you're new, one of the things that happens is that you sort of, it takes a while to figure out that timing. And so frequently we go out and we expect corn skiing, and it would just be heinous and bulletproof and totally terrible skiing. And so I have to admit, I probably wasn't a very reflective learner at that point. And I'd be like, man, those conditions weren't at all what we were expecting. And then I'd be like, that sucked. And that was a weekend ruined. And then I'd go back and do it again. And eventually we start to recognize, like, oh, there's a pattern that I'm missing here. So, a way to really direct your learning and maybe shortcut, instead of spending 5 weekends going out and missing the corn cycle, maybe it's only a couple, is just reflecting on, wow, conditions weren't what we expected. What did we do that missed it? Maybe we go back and we look through other observations and we see like, oh, people were hitting corn, or we were actually kind of too early in the day, or maybe we were too late in the day. So it's all about setting up that process to more quickly and more targetedly build your pattern recognition skills. Similarly, if you get it right, if you were expecting powder and you had like the deepest day of your life, it's really, and no one got caught in an avalanche, it's really good to reflect. Did we do it right? What did we do right? Or did we actually get lucky and use that as a learning experience? So all of this is about like why I think education is so important is giving you that risk management process so that you can go out and gain that experiential learning, but then also a learning process. So instead of kind of just going out there and sort of haphazardly gaining experience, you can really target areas that you don't know so that you can quickly build your experience in kind of to counter that wicked learning environment that you're existing in. So just to reiterate, I like to keep this picture in mind. Like this is why, to me, this is why Avalanche education matters, because this is something that could potentially happen. 4 people go out and you're thinking, this is working, we're doing great. And then that 5th person goes and you realize like we made the wrong decision, we messed up somewhere. And then keeping in mind, like, what if there had only been 3 people and that 5th person didn't trigger the avalanche? We were still doing the same thing and we never got the feedback that we were off. And again, avalanche education, this risk management process, this learning process isn't necessarily going to alleviate all these problems. Like this wicked problem is still going to continue to exist. But I think avalanche education is going to give you a head start and a process to begin to reflect on that, so that you notice those times where you had a near miss but didn't realize it, and you can hopefully take that and learn from that experience. I went the wrong direction here. So yeah, just want to end on this slide. And so whatever flavor of avalanche education you go get, and there are a lot of reputable providers out there, you know, make sure that you're taking away a process. So just like when you get the gear that you need, you have a beacon, shovel, and probe, you also want to make sure that avalanche education provides you something tangible and that you come away with both a risk management process that's going to grow with you and a learning process that will help you really target gaining experience and learning in the backcountry. So that's all I have. I guess I get to pass the mic to Anne.
Thanks, Liz. That was great. I think my Bostonian friends would call it wicked interesting. So I just want to remind everybody, anybody who's jumping in late, hop into that Q&A. You can raise your hand, but it's really not going to do anything. The Q&A is really the best way to kind of get questions up to the panel that'll be coming up after we hear a little bit of their thoughts first. Next, we're going to hear from Anne. She's a researcher. She's done a lot of, you'll hear kind of what she's been studying and looking into about how people use avalanche education, and thought maybe we'd start off with a question for you. So you'll see here a poll just jumped up on your screen right there. You can kind of dive on in, and you'll see how some of these questions are actually going to tie directly in to some of Anne's research, and you can see kind of, where you might be on potentially some of her graphs or whatnot. So dive on in. You can start voting at any point. And we'll just give you a few more seconds, and then we'll carry on. Here we go. People are finding the poll now. Who's in the room? All right, I'm trying to get to 50% attendance. That'd be pretty good. It's kind of like national elections where like around 50% of people vote, 60%. That's pretty good. All right. Thanks everybody for playing along. Here's who we got in the poll. I can actually share those results so you can kind of see as well who we got. And without any further ado, I'm gonna kick it off and let Ann take it over. Thanks, Ann. Melis here is the executive director of the Alaska Avalanche Center. And we're really, really excited to have her along with us and hear a little bit more of her perspective and a little bit of what Avalanche education means to her.
Yeah, thanks for the intro, Greg. Everybody for having me here. I saw from the poll there were no ice climbers, so I feel like maybe my background warrants a little explanation. These are ice climbing screws, so I'm probably a minority here as a climber, but I certainly do a lot of backcountry skiing and snow climbing as well. So yeah, for 5 years, I've been executive director of Alaska Avalanche School. So I know a lot of people in Colorado are familiar with an ARI level 1 avalanche education. That's definitely ARI stepping grounds, but there's a lot of avalanche schools and programs throughout the country. And so in Alaska, we have an independent curriculum that's certified by the American Avalanche Association, and we teach recreational classes, professional classes, awareness classes. So I see a lot of you have an awareness level background, and I would encourage you to go forward with your education. And so, it's a pretty personal answer to the question is, why is avalanche education important? And I would say, you can get a book. You could try to learn through the school hard knocks. That's kind of tough. You're going to get bit. But when you have a really experienced, talented avalanche educator within arm's reach, it really brings the curriculum alive. You will learn a lot more than you would learn in a book. There's all the unspoken things that you learn just by watching somebody that's very comfortable in that environment and in that terrain. I will share a couple slides with you as I chat. Whoop. I'll go back a little bit. So the other thing about my background is I've worked with the formal rescue groups as well. And so for a number of years, I was a climbing ranger at Denali National Park. I've worked on ambulance services and so forth. And one of the hardest kind of things job-wise is not only making decisions for you and your groups and your friends, but making decisions about how to respond to an emergency. So there's all the pressures and the things that Liz was talking about that come into play when you are trying to make decisions for yourself. But when you know somebody's in harm's way and they need help and you're trying to decide whether to enter that situation, that can be really hard and stressful. In Alaska, what drives me to do my job and my career is just how much people in Alaska are exposed to avalanche terrain. So we have winter like pretty much 9 months out of the year, and most of our terrain is covered with, snow-covered mountains. So here's a little scale. Alaskans always love to rub it in your face how big the state is. It's about 450% larger than Colorado. And then what this slide shows you is how little area in our state is forecast. And so you're so lucky in Colorado. The Colorado Avalanche Information Center has a really wide net, and they do an excellent job of forecasting over an enormous amount of terrain. But look here in Alaska, you'll see here, this is the only area where my pointer is that's yellow, that receives a daily forecast in the winter. The second most popular riding area is right here, and they get some professional observations throughout the week and just a forecast every Saturday. The problem with that is we see a lot of avalanche accidents and fatalities outside those areas. So I kind of just pulled the last 4. We have somebody out here in the Aleutians and on Alaska that was buried and killed in an avalanche, a snowmobiler. We have a lot that happened here on the Kenai Peninsula in unforecast areas. We actually just had a snow bike accident where somebody was buried but recovered in that area. Here in the Eastern Alaska range, we've had fatalities above Haines, next to Ketchikan. So all these areas don't receive forecasts. So that's a big problem when you look and this is over a very big time frame, but if you look kind of at fatalities by state, you see Alaska's number 2. The problem with that is we have 700,000 residents, so when you compare that to Colorado, where, what was it, you have almost like 6 million people in Colorado. People in Alaska are living and recreating and working with outsized risk to avalanches. And we believe that's because of, lack of education. If you're going to go into an area that's not forecast, you have to know quite a bit. Even if there is a forecast, you need to collect information to see, are these things lining up with what they prepared me for mentally? Am I seeing the kinds of things that contribute to avalanches in the terrain, on this slope, on this aspect that I'm interested in? And so for Alaskans, even a basic avalanche course would involve perhaps a lot more than some other areas of the country, because we're pretty sure you are at some point going to go into areas that are unforecast, and many of our residents are consistently going in areas that aren't forecast. So it's really important to not only read and understand a forecast, but also understand all the things that happen to a snowflake to either make it really fun to play on or work under or travel by, or the things that make it really risky. And so, like I said, you can get some of this from a book, but you can also study organic chemistry by yourself. But it's really nice to be able to ask somebody questions, have somebody boil it down to its most simple parts to help you make good decisions. The other thing about avalanche education is, for decades and decades and decades, it's been built upon educating the ski industry. And even if you're a skier right now, today, there's probably going to be a point in your not too distant future where you're going to explore another snow sport. One, I would say, backcountry skiing is going to be kind of your like gateway into other snow sports. And as this winter, we're seeing an enormous blossom all across the country, even in Alaska, in backcountry travel, snow travel. People are not going to want to be in the front ranges as much. And so you might at some point invest in a snowmobile to be able to get a couple of layers in a day, where you're seeing less and less crowds. And so it's really important with education that you mix it up between groups. So something we started doing in Alaska is, on our one-day rescue clinics, we'll mix people that are traditionally snowmobilers with skiers, because they need to learn how to work together on a rescue. And if somebody gets buried, you're going to want a snow machine we call them snow machines in Alaska, but snowmobile, to help you transport stuff back and forth to the debris pile, help you expedite a search, carry out an injured climber or skier. And so this image on your left is kind of interesting, because we've spent a lot of time in Alaska trying to educate snowmobilers to the same level that our backcountry ski industry is. And so, yeah, you see they've identified snow layers with the spray paint that they have in their can and so forth, but how's that going to affect your results, and is that useful? And so kind of reining it all in and making sure that avalanche education is kind of evenly distributed among people that we're seeing that are in accidents. So like I said, I come from a climbing and a search and rescue background, and dealing with the evolving conditions of snow can really complicate a rescue. Some of my trickiest situations I've been in are trying to make the best assessment possible about snow, to make sure that other rescuers aren't going to be harmed in a recovery or an extrication. And so, don't discount that the times of year when you might be just climbing or traveling on snow and you don't have your skis on, that you're also exposed to overhead avalanche hazard. This was from an interesting search and rescue I was part of. You can see here, this is an airplane that landed, actually crashed into the side of a mountain. And there were a few days when we thought there would have been survivors. But when you're looking at this, what you don't know is it drops several 1,000 feet below the plane. But this is where we could have easily accessed this site by helicopter above. But now we have to make a decision in an unforecast area. How many people are we going to put on this slope? Do we want to put them on the slope at all? How augured in is that plane? How's the weather changing? And over the course of days that we're trying to make these decisions. And then, you know, what a generic avalanche education does is it gives you the tools to deal with situations that somebody might have never thought of. And in this case, we ended up ski cutting this slope while attached to a helicopter by a short haul line. We ended up searching the airplane while attached to a helicopter, understanding that avalanche hazard conditions were too high to be unassisted. And that's not something you'll learn in a class, but when you're with a group of people of similar education background, you can kind of come up with those solutions. So that's kind of taking it to an extreme, I realize, but a number of you are probably Mountain Rescue Association members, and you're going to be at some point forced to make some of these decisions for your team if you don't have access to an avalanche forecaster. And so a good education can help you do that. This is another situation here up in Alaska. This is Mount Dickey, and they had an enormous avalanche. They get rated based on size on a destructive scale. And this was like a D4, D5 avalanche. And right here, there's two climbers, and they triggered the avalanche here, and it stepped down, and it actually remotely triggered this whole slope above them. And so then, like, the decision is, as a mountain rescue member, do we have them hike out themselves? Is that safe? Do we hike in? Can we land a helicopter? What exposures is the helicopter going to be in responding to this? So why should you get an education? Well, because if you love snow, and you love snow at any degree or angle, you're likely going to be in avalanche terrain. Forecasters do a really good job of getting it right. But sometimes they get it wrong. They don't know exactly how the slope you're choosing to recreate on is going to do over an extended period of time. And so it's really empowering to have the tools to make those decisions for yourself and your team that you're with. Thanks so much for having me.
Wow, that was cool. I have some questions myself, but I will hold them off until the Q&A. And I will encourage everybody else to drop questions into the chat. You can go to the bottom, you can see other ones, comment on them, like them. That was great. Thank you. We could take some questions now. I could, Anne, how are we feeling about maybe the screen share? I've got another poll I want to throw out you while we're just giving her a second to kind of, there we are. I'm just curious. I was going to start this off at the beginning of that. I just like to know who's in the room. Some of you I probably recognize, some might be new, just kind of curious. Who we got here? You could probably try the screen share while it's going too, if you want to. Oh. That works, yeah.
Yeah, we're in business now.
The virtual world, it's amazing that this can even happen. Anne's in Canada, Liz is up in Washington, Melis is in Alaska. This is great.
Pretty amazing. How's that poll, Greg? Did you get your 50%?
We are at 70%. We are ready to go. I'm going to share the results. You can see who we got in here. Pretty neat.
Oh, very cool.
All right. Thank you, Anne.
Very cool. Yeah, well, thanks so much for having me, and sorry about the technical difficulties, which seem to come with the territory, but it's really an honor to take part of this event. And what I thought I would contribute to the conversation today are some insights from some research that we've been conducting with the Simon Fraser University Avalanche Research Program that give us some more detail into why education matters from a research perspective. So this is the product of a collaborative effort between myself, my colleague Henry Finn, and my supervisor, Pascal Hagley. And there's also some ongoing efforts with current students, Katie Fisher and Abby Morgan. But I'd like to start with kind of a backwards approach to this presentation by sharing a key result of our research. So we found that education matters because level of education is repeatedly the most significant factor that influences how well recreationists can recall, understand, and apply the Avalanche Bulletin information. And so I'm starting here because, interestingly, our initial intent with our research was not to study the effectiveness of avalanche education. Our objective was to study how we can improve avalanche forecasts. But with that, I'll now fill you in on how we got here, and I'll share some more detailed insights from this research. So like I mentioned, our goal was to identify opportunities to improve the Avalanche Bulletin. And so we were asking, how do recreationists use, understand, and apply the information? What are users' needs and expectations? And what are some challenges that need to be overcome? And so we approached this by dividing our research into two phases. In this first phase, we conducted qualitative interviews to identify different patterns that people were using to use the forecast. And we wanted to classify those patterns into a user typology. And then in phase two, we wanted to look at those patterns more broadly across the population with a large-scale survey. And we wanted to investigate whether recreationists have the skills they need to use the bulletin at their level. This is of my colleague Henry Finn, and I'll dive into this in some more detail. So with the interviews, we conducted 46 hour-long conversations with a wide range of recreationists across the southwestern BC, so Vancouver, Squamish, Whistler, and Pemberton. And to analyze the interview data, I conducted a qualitative applied thematic analysis to look for these patterns and to establish a classification system. And so what emerged was this Avalanche Bulletin user typology, which has 5 distinct patterns that increase in sophistication. So at the first level, the first stage, our type A users are absent and they're not using the Avalanche Bulletin. Our type B users next are using the danger rating, and they're using it to determine whether or not to go out on a given day. Our type C users are also primarily using the danger rating, but they combine it with knowledge of avalanche terrain to decide if exposure is appropriate on a given day. And our type D users are the first to apply the avalanche problems and to integrate the nature of the problem, the distribution, the likelihood, and size into their decision framework. And then type E's are extending their evaluation. So they're using all of the information, but they're using it as a starting point. And then they're going into the field and confirming or disconfirming the forecast with a localized assessment. So knowing these 5 patterns, we then wanted to see more within the entire recreational community. So we conducted this survey and we had an incredible response with over 3,000 participants survey. We had solid representation from the US. So you can also see on the map there fantastic support from the community in Colorado. So thank you to anyone who completed it who's on the call today. In terms of gender breakdown, 1/4 of our sample were women and 3/4 were men. And we had a wide range in age demographics as well. And we were very strategic in the survey design. So we composed a list of statements for each of the bulletin user types, A, B, C, D, and E. And we had users within the first set of questions self-select their bulletin user type. And then from that, we showed them a series of questions to examine their recall, their comprehension, and their information application of the products at their level. So if you told us you were a type B or C, these questions centered on the danger rating information. If you told us you were a type D or E, you saw more questions relating to the avalanche problem information. And then with these responses, we scored them in terms of sufficiency or insufficiency. And this was based on whether the response demonstrated a level of comprehension required to make safe and informed decisions consistently. And to analyze this data, Henry and Pascal used a statistical method called conditional inference trees, or C trees. And this allowed them to identify the most significant statistical relationships between bulletin literacy scores and participants' background characteristics. And the benefit of this method is that it produces a classification tree that not only displays the significant splits, but it also highlights their relative importance. So the higher up in the tree it appears, the more significant it is. And to keep things simple, we'll only be highlighting results from the C-tree analysis that emerged as the first and most significant split in the data. And so what we saw was that for type B and C users, if you had basic awareness training, it significantly improved your danger rating recall. You were much better able to recite what the levels of the danger rating scale are. If you were a type D user that was integrating the Avalanche problems, a level 2 Avalanche course significantly improved how well you understood the appropriate mitigation strategies for the Avalanche problem types. And then if you were a type E user who's extending the information into the field, professional level training significantly improved your Avalanche problem recall, but also your skills applying the bulletin information to a hypothetical terrain scenario. And I want to stop here because this slope choice scenario question was really interesting. It was a question that was consistent across everyone who completed the survey. But this is a notable result here because more than half of the participants who took the survey at all levels failed to provide a sufficient answer in this application exercise. And so these results suggest that stronger emphasis needs to be placed on helping recreationists learn and practice application skills so that they are not solely a product of professional training. In a final phase of this analysis, the responses from recall, comprehension, and application were combined to an overall literacy score, and another round of C-trees were conducted. We looked at the relationships there. So type A's were not included in this analysis. For type B's, there were no significant splits. But for type C and type D users, having a level 1 Avalanche course significantly improved your overall bulletin literacy and your performance in those questions. And then again, for type E users, professional training significantly improved the literacy there. And so what we see here is an overview of the relationships between Avalanche bulletin user types and the level of education that helps to build the literacy skills at each stage. And I think this is a very gratifying and affirming picture. However, there is more than meets the eye. One of the things that stood out from Henry's results is that Avalanche education not only improved participants' performance, but it also increased their self-reported Avalanche bulletin user type, which is what you would expect. The more training you have, the higher you see yourself on the typology. However, many of the participants did not have the skills that we would expect to see at their level. And this suggests that while education is a driver of literacy, it may also promote overconfidence, which is something we heard from Liz as well. And so this is a key takeaway, that it is important that with education, we not only teach these skills, but we also emphasize realistic expectations for what recreationists can do with these skills and what else is needed to stay safe in the backcountry. There were also additional factors that emerged beyond education that played a role in participants' performance. So age for type Cs over the age of 54 demonstrated difficulty with danger rating recall, and type Ds over the age of 45 with avalanche problem recall. For activity types, there were many examples of how activity type was influential, but some main ones were that type C and B snowshoers and snowmobilers had difficulty with danger rating, elevation band, and aspect icon comprehension. And finally, for type E participants with fewer than 10 days each winter, they had difficulty with avalanche problem comprehension. And so these are important to consider for future studies. And to do that, we went back to the interview data to look for potential clues as to how these factors might be playing a role. And here are a few quotes I'd like to offer as some insight. So participant 8 feels like things change a lot, and maybe that's just because they haven't been able to ski that much lately, but I feel like it changes frequently and you're always trying to figure out how to work it again. Additionally, participant 20 asked, is it worth a snowshoer going through the whole avalanche course when we're only out there 2 or 3 times a year? That's kind of been my hesitation in not doing it, even though I've had intentions for sure. So these quotes suggest that infrequent backcountry use, which is to be expected among a recreational audience, may act as a barrier to bulletin literacy and to avalanche education in our current system. Also with activity types, there was a strong theme around topics of inclusion with regard to activities that Melis talked about as well. So participant 9 voiced that there's no formalized curriculum for an ice climbing specific course, and that the information is not really that topical to ice climbing and kind of weans out a lot of people. Participant 20 discussed that as a snowshoer, they hear that they have less risk than a backcountry skier, and so maybe these things aren't taken as seriously, and that was a deterrent for them taking a course. And participant 36 said that they had done snowshoeing for many years, but because they started backcountry skiing, that's why there was a need for avalanche training. So these themes suggest that in both public forecasting and in avalanche education, we still have much work to do to be more inclusive of the diversity of ways in which people recreate in the backcountry. So just a few take-home points. Avalanche education and avalanche bulletins are key components in a highly integrated public avalanche safety system. The lack of application skills that we observed in the results, as well as these factors such as age and activity type, the fact that they play such a significant role suggests that there's room for improvement within the system. And it is important that we continue to engage in systematic social science research to better understand the strengths and weaknesses of this current system and to identify ways to move forward. So a quick acknowledgement to all who make our research possible, as well as I'd like to acknowledge the Coast Salish people on whose lands we've conducted these studies. And feel free to reach out with any additional questions, but I think we can get into a broader conversation now.
Thanks, Anne.
Yeah.
That's great. So drop in questions if you have come in, if you've been answered. I think maybe a few of these that have been kind of type answered, maybe we'll want to address on video as well, just so people who watch this afterwards can get some of those answers. I think they might have questions. I have a question for you, Anne, about,
Sure.
So Anne's a forecaster up in Avalanche, Canada. And I'm just curious, like as a researcher, how does that affect your forecast? Are you thinking about like A, B, C, D, and do you write for one group or the other, or how does that kind of play together?
Yeah, we don't have maybe formal guidelines that you might imagine, but it's certainly at the forefront of a lot of the questions we ask. And the way that the forecast is organized here in Canada is on 3 tabs. So I do actually keep in mind the user types when I'm writing on each tab. And so the first is meant to be for the entry-level audience, and I try to keep the language and sophistication to an entry level, and then scale it up as I'm writing each section. So some of the ways that the forecast is organized here in Canada do facilitate writing to the different types. Yeah, good question.
I had a question for Liz, since we have Liz here. I think I know some people on the call might be curious. I think it'd be great to hear, like, who should take a rec class, who should take a professional class. Can you just give your kind of high level, there are these two streams, and here's who should be going into which stream?
Yeah, so you know, I think the biggest difference, it's easier to describe what a professional is, and then maybe everyone else should take a recreational course. But you know, professional is really somebody who is a member of an organization that's managing risk for others, managing or mitigating, I guess, hazard to others. And so that professional training really centers around teaching people the skills to contribute, to take and contribute data to an organization that can like turn all those data into hazard messaging, into managing or mitigating avalanche hazard to the public, like through ski patrols or the highway. So a lot of it's like really focused on being, I don't want to diminish it to say that you're like a cog in the system, but it is being a productive contributor to a larger system. And so it really, like, that training only works if you have a larger system to plug into. And so you can see as like a recreational traveler, like you don't have that larger system to plug into. And a lot of ways you have a harder job because you're doing something on your day off with your friends, which introduces a whole dynamic. Like if you can imagine if you had to work with your friends, like I mean, we do sort of work with our friends, but can you imagine if like you had to be professional with your friends? I can think of a few friends where I'm like, we wouldn't get anything done and we'd be bickering and arguing all the time. And so you're asking people to do this like big thing, consequential thing with your friends on your days off, and you like you're not as plugged in, right? You spend, generally, if this is your hobby, you spend the week plugged into something else. And it may be managing risk in a different context, but you're not like necessarily plugged in to the mountains and the conditions there. You're not part of a team. Your team changes every weekend. And so a lot of recreational education is about giving you tools to adapt to those situations. So, you know, I would recommend recreational education for everybody, right? Even professionals. Like I think every professional that's in this room can speak to some time where you had kind of a guide's day off moment, and hopefully that just like usually results in not going anywhere. I've had a couple of those where like 6 of us took 3 dogs for a walk. We thought we were going skiing, but we really just ended up walking the dogs for several miles, and we realized we had no plan. We just kind of like went out walking. And so I think that like is valuable education even for professionals. That wasn't a short answer, but really
Great.
just trying to get at, you know, professional is not like, it's not like kitchen appliances where the pro end of something is like better and going to help you do something better. It's like inherently geared towards people who are doing something that's almost fundamentally different from what you're doing as a recreational traveler.
Thanks. That's great.
Yeah.
And I had a question for Melis about the helicopter dangling ski cut. I saw you mentioned it in the chat, but I think maybe the YouTube audience and anybody else who's tuning in later is want to hear some more about that.
Yeah, so nothing super common, but just an example of how you can take your education to an extreme. And so our team was really tight, highly trained, and we've been in a number of scenarios where we really had to think outside the box. And given the skill and ability of our crew, we thought, well, how can we manage this hazard? So many of you think of Ski cutting is maybe something you would do to safely trigger an avalanche to clear all hazards from the slope. You see that more with heli ski guides. Ski patrollers do it, so it would fall into that kind of pro level category. So that was a consideration for something we could do to make the scene safe for a rescue we had. When I attended a training with the National Avalanche School, I was surprised that they were teaching to probe and search debris on short haul, which is something they do in Europe. I'd say more so in the United States. There's only a few SAR programs where you regularly work with in the country and train kind of with the same pilots. And so you need really good trust and communication in your team to be able to pull something like that off.
That's really amazing. So that makes me think about, so there was another question that came up about just kind of here, maybe, how you all feel about it or think about it. The question of how do you know when you're getting lucky, or how do you know when you made good decisions? Who wants to go first?
I feel like that's a Liz one because she opened the can of worms.
Well, I think you all would have probably an interesting or thought to it.
Well, I'll start because you're right. I've given a similar talk about this wicked learning environment a couple of years ago at NSAW. And I got to the end of the talk and I was like, I didn't really answer the question. I just threw like a big can of worms out there and then walked away. And as I was talking through it this time, I was like, still didn't answer the question. I think I gave a really good reason for why you need avalanche education, but I think somebody put this in the questions as just kind of a comment, like there is an element of you're never going to close that uncertainty gap or eliminate the risk. And so there is a little bit of like accepting that everything we do in life has some risk. Winter backcountry travel does maybe have more risk than others. And I think it sort of comes down to the education part is important so that you're making an informed engagement with that risk, that the level of risk you're taking on, so you can name your level of risk acceptance and that it's matched with the people that you're with, and that you I guess that you can say like, I am informed in doing this and I'm consciously making this choice. But I think that you may not ever know. And that weird feeling, I definitely like, this is what people say when they get older. The older you get, the more you're like, wow, I maybe just got lucky. It's like things you recognize in hindsight. And maybe that's also something that more just as much as like actually being involved with an avalanche sort of drives home some conservatism, is like with more experience recognizing like, oh, I actually just probably got lucky in a couple of those instances. So yeah, it's not a good answer. I mean, I think you don't know, but knowing that you don't know is also like an impetus for both the decisions I make and the continued learning that I engage in.
Yeah, maybe I'll try and take a stab at this good question here. I'm going to just use all the things that you threw out though, Liz, in your presentation, which to bring it back to Liz's talk where she broke it down into predict, observe, compare. I feel like the comparison stage is where we really diagnose our luck. And one thing, when we do this in our debrief at the end of the day, I really like to compare my perspective with everyone else out there, and ask that really key question, when were we most at risk? Because in making that comparison, I might highlight some of my own blind spots and identify ways in which I was lucky because I wasn't aware of the risk that day. So I think that debrief stage and that comparison is really key. And I think there's also really important ways to bring that humility and openness to other accidents, as tragic as they may be, honoring the people who are involved by really listening to the ways in which they were unlucky and seeing them in all the choices that I also make. So I use those two concrete approaches to try and make sense of all of the uncertainty that exists that Liz just talked about. Yeah.
Well, I'll answer this one last. And I know I've been lucky because I've triggered avalanches and not get caught. And if I had triggered them from the side or from below or somewhere else, it was the difference between being buried and not buried. And it's been some of my most humbling, professionally disappointing low points in my life to think, yeah, I had this, and either somebody wasn't brave enough to question me and my decision making, or I wasn't brave enough to question somebody else and their decision making. And those human dynamics, we talk about it time and time again, are really the crucible. And as you spend more time in the outdoors, it holds up a really great mirror to you. And hopefully you survive long enough to see enough of those reflections to be a better travel partner, because your inherent weaknesses and the types of such troublesome situations you get yourself into don't match everybody else's. You have your own unique human failings. Chances are you're going to make the same mistake way more than once. And it takes a really talented educator and really good team of backcountry travelers to help you identify that and say, you know, I'm the person that's always really impatient when we need to really sit down and have a good discussion in a tricky situation. Or I put a lot of pressure on myself on my weekends because my Monday through Fridays are so unsatisfying. Or, you know, it's going to be whatever it is for you. There are these archetypes. And we've gotten better and better in avalanche education, including that, even in very basic avalanche education. And then the further and further you go in your avalanche education, you get more reflective and you spend more time on figuring that out.
That's great. Yeah, thank you. I think I know I've been very lucky many times. And I like to think about that slide that Liz showed. There's the fifth person who triggered the avalanche, but what happens if there were just 3 people? And I think I've been out a lot with 2 or 3 people, and I've had a lot of days like that. So I believe in the process. I believe in the debrief. And I have, there's days that I continue to debrief years later, and I still wonder if that was the best, everything worked out fine that day. It was a great day, but was it the best call? I don't know. So I guess my last question, unless anybody else has other ones that I had, was curious, just as 3 people who I'm just going to assume value and prioritize avalanche education, do you go skiing with an airbag every time? Is that an essential piece of equipment for you? I'll start. I don't. I only take an airbag really. I take it on rescue. I take it on times where I feel like I might not be able to control my terrain choices and might end up places where I don't want to be. Or if it's days where I have avalanche terrain on my run list, I'll bring it that day. But generally I don't. So curious what you all say.
I do. I don't have a formal position on the topic. There is research from my research group that looks at the effectiveness of airbags, and they do have a purpose and a use out there. For me, it mainly comes from it is required for my work as an avalanche forecaster, and then once I pack for the season, I'm packed because I don't do well in scenarios where I have to move from bag to bag. So it's really just a systems perspective for me, and yeah, I know that the technology has a role. So yeah.
I probably have a similar thing where I have an airbag. And admittedly, I have an airbag because it was made available to me at a price point that was manageable and hard to refuse. And so once I acquired it, I made the choice to just that's my bag. because I didn't want to have an option around it, because I felt like that was a tricky, like thinking about in my car, I'm like, oh, I'm just driving down to the post office, I'm going to turn the airbag off. Like all the airbags are always on. I don't have a choice. And so I wanted to have that similar thing. Like I didn't want to get into splitting hairs over whether this was warranted an airbag. I felt like that was a slippery slope. And I have too much decision fatigue in my life all the time. So I just needed to reduce one. So I just commit to it and call it weight training, even though I'm probably like, I don't go and avalanche train because I have too many other competing things, like paying for a babysitter and like being exhausted, that make it a bad idea to be an avalanche terrain. So I probably don't need to carry the airbag, but I just made that decision and I just stick by it. Not based on science or anything.
Yeah, I mentioned this in the type comments, but things like airbags and avalanches, we know they stack things in your favor. You're not going to know the exact flavor of avalanche you trigger. You're not going to know how deeply you've been buried. And I've been surprised when you look at the stats, even in Colorado, these really deep burials. And I think we're going to continue to see these really deep burials, because with the climate change we're seeing, the persistent deep slab avalanche problem is becoming more universal. We're seeing them more every season. So that's just the way that the storms come in and leave, and how big the storms are every time. When you see these huge weather fluctuations, you can expect that. So that means a couple of things. If you have an airbag, you want to be as close to the surface as possible. So it's really easy for your partners to dig you out. The digging is the most time-consuming part of a rescue. And I see people show up on avalanche courses with really rinky-dink probes, like 240 centimeters. If it came free with your avalanche safety package, this could have changed. I mean, I need to shop around a little bit, but when I first bought my first avalanche safety package, it came with a Lexan shovel and like a probe a Barbie doll could use. I mean, it was like, if it came free with your beacon, I don't know, check the specs, because what I would recommend is nothing less than a 300 centimeter probe. And still, what we're finding is with people buried in Colorado, they're going full probe, not finding their partner, having to dig and then reprobe. And so, you know, there's a lot of good reason to think that an airbag would really help you float, hopefully not get buried at all, or at least have a shallow burial. But it's not going to work if you never pull the cord. And what happens is, if you don't attach the leg strap, when you're getting tumbled in an avalanche, the backpack just gets pulled up like this. And so you're reaching for the cord here and it's not there. It's like up here or back here, because it's getting pulled away from your body. And you can actually adjust that cord, and you got to read through the booklet and get it in a position where you can hold it. And then, you know, I would recommend getting an airbag that is easily rechargeable or activated by a fan, something that encourages you to practice with it and make sure it's working. And like tumble down a slope and make sure that, you know, when you replicate the best you can being caught in an avalanche, it's in a position where you can grab it. Because there was a case in Alaska just 3 or 4 days ago where this guy was getting carried and he went for it like 3 times and couldn't get it. And so he did a swimming motion and it ended up towards the top of the debris, but the debris pile was significant. And he was disconcerted that like he was actively trying to reach it and he couldn't, and that's user error. So that's kind of scary. He got lucky. He knows he got lucky. He wasn't buried deeper.
Great, thank you. We got one more came in. It says, how does communication learning play into avalanche education? How can it enhance or hinder overall avalanche learning in your experience? So like kind of what's the communication side of everything we're talking about, these hard skills of reading the forecast?
Yeah, I'm not sure I totally understand the question, so I'm having a hard time thinking through a response. Yeah, sorry to Leah. I'm not clear, but feel free, Liz or Melis, if you have thoughts on what this is getting at.
I mean, I might take a stab at just kind of probably the dead horse that I harp on every course about, you know, there's all this stuff we want to understand about the science around unstable snow and how to intuit out where the unstable snow is. But I think like the bigger hindrance is just the fact that it's like a group of humans involved, and going back to it's a group of humans on their days off. And like humans just do really, like, we've seen this. We have all sorts of economists that can point out that humans just like do things irrationally and don't act in our best interest. And that's just like human nature acting. And then there's the like all the added things with communication. And I like don't even need to spend any time enumerating all the ways in which humans are ineffective at communicating with each other. So all that is to say, I think that we acknowledge that, but one of the deficiencies of education that I see is that you're oftentimes like you don't necessarily take a course with 3 of your best friends. Like you should take a course with people that you go out with, but then you've got this added element of other people there that you're trying to communicate with. It's not always realistic. It's like too far off the deep end of like trying to mingle with new folks, and like it's some bad like speed dating mixer in which you're trying to make consequential decisions, and that's like not realistic, and that's not practicing the skills that you might actually need to practice, like how to communicate with your spouse in the backcountry, how to communicate with your children in the backcountry. Like those are the really challenging ones. And we don't have like a great way to address that. I mean, maybe I should recommend that everyone goes to therapy together to like learn communication skills. Maybe there's like, maybe Melis or Anne, you guys have valuable communication curriculum that like, I think that could probably be really valuable, but it is not something yet that is focused on, at least in the area curriculum.
That'll be our next webinar, why therapy matters.
Why everyone should go to therapy.
All right. Well,
Go ahead.
Nope, that's it.
Oh, I was going to say, we've had a big shift in our curriculum, you know, from human factor to just like humanness, and what are the behaviors that can or cannot contribute to an accident. And there are a number of things that we have in our humanness that, you know, you've probably heard Laura McGuire, Liz, speak about this, that, you know, they would love to have machine learning replicate the human mind and how efficiently we can make really complex decisions. And sometimes, you know, that is what saves us. And so communication, of course, is the things that you say. In our curriculum, we have these 6 decision point questions that kind of guide you through how you make the next leg of your journey with your team. But then there's all the nonverbal communication. Is this person speaking up? Are they eating? Are they drinking? Are they telling you they're not sure if they're going to ski down the slope, but they've already ripped their skins off? Like, you know, what are all these other things that are leading you there? And you practice that in an avalanche course, and your instructors are trained in helping guide those conversations, pick up on things. And you know, the more time you can spend traveling in the field with a field group and learning how people communicate their decisions about whether we should or should not go on the next leg of the journey, that's really good practice to do with somebody of more ability there, that's trained in navigating those conversations. So another plug for education.
Yeah, I'd like to chime in on that too. That same exact point, just that both of you made, that the level 2 course seems to be this golden opportunity for exactly what we're talking about, for you to rally your group of core partners, to repeat your process with the feedback and mentorship of a trained professional, to get that outsider perspective and a little bit of almost therapy from an Avalanche perspective on what your group might be missing and how your group dynamics are coming into the risk management picture. So definitely a plug for continuing education, and these courses can be repeated, especially if you put together a new group for a big expedition one season. Consider in the lead up, getting out there for a course and getting some feedback on your process together. Yeah.
Love it.
I have maybe one more thing to piggyback onto all of that then too, is that at some point view Avalanche education as just education. And so that process that I was talking about, that learning process of predict, observe, compare, you know, when you figure out the areas that you want to build your skills, at some point that is, you're going to recognize that that extends beyond like just avalanches. And so maybe it really is like, I want to be a really skilled facilitator to make these like kind of hairy risk management decisions, or this feeds into my job and search and rescue. And so you seek out education specifically in communication. And yeah, it's not avalanche education, but it's avalanche education because you recognize it's an area that impacts your ability to work with others to manage risk. And so that's why it's so important to have this learning process so that you can seek out areas of growth and then really target them. Because I think that there's a lot of educational opportunities that are really enhance your skills as a backcountry traveler that wouldn't be billed as avalanche education.
Yeah, I love that. Any last words of wisdom that we can kind of squeeze out of you? Thank you. You've all been so generous with your time. Really appreciate having you all be here. But if there's anything else you'd like to tell us, we'd love to hear it. I do also want to remind everybody, anybody who jumped on late, that this is all going to be on our website. You can come to mountainrescueaspen.org/education. You can watch it there. You can share it with friends. So you can come back and kind of revisit this conversation as well. Anything else? Well,
No,
then,
just thank you so much for putting this together, Greg. I've really enjoyed being a part of it, and I've learned so much. So thank you.
yeah,
Thank you,
thank you
Greg.
all. And I really want to thank you all. And I just kind of want to make a plug. We want to hear some feedback. There's a bunch of ways you can give us feedback. I'm dropping some links here into that chat, but also send you a follow-up email. So there's a form there. Would love to hear your thoughts. What else you'd like to learn in the future? How we could improve these experiences, and support these nonprofits. This is all brought to you by nonprofits. So please support those nonprofits that support you. Thank you all.